Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? It's crazy to think that MP3 files have been common for 20 years. But of course, over time, technology and music listening habits change. So are we looking at the impending doom of the MP3 player? So a couple of weeks ago from when this video went live, Apple announced that it's finally discontinuing the iPod Shuffle and Nano, which to me is actually a much bigger thing than it seems. It seems like the general reaction from a lot of people were, well, finally, because nobody buys those anymore. And if you look at their, general sales, yes, they've obviously been trending downward, but it really kind of struck a nerve and a chord with me simultaneously. It struck a nerve in that I've been using iPod Nanos on a daily basis for years now. I take them with me when I go running, and they're perfect for that. And I know a lot of other people who really love the Nano and the Shuffle rather, and its form factor, if not the Nano, just for exercise purposes, or when they need just a really simple music player that they're willing to sacrifice if something goes wrong. That's what really the appeal for me from the Shuffle always has been. I mean, these cost $50 and they have excellent battery life. I have to charge it up every 2 or 3 weeks at most, even though I use it 45 minutes a day every day of the week. And it still supports analog headphones, which means that when I go out for a run, I can take cheap headphones with me instead of expensive, higher end ones. And it's a very simple setup. If I get caught out in the rain or if I slip and fall or whatever, I don't really have to worry quite so much about, well, did I just ruin a very expensive device? At worst, I'm out $50 for a new Shuffle and maybe another $15 for headphones. And where that announcement really kind of struck a chord with me is that it got me thinking about the topic of MP3 players in general. For those of you who got worked up last week about me talking about Apple, don't worry, I'm not really going to be focused on Apple on this episode. They're just a great example because they've been very involved in the dedicated MP3 player market for a long time. And Apple's seeming exit from it by discontinuing those two products really kind of goes to show that there's much, much less of a market for those products anymore. You don't really see them on store shelves so much like you used to. There used to be a wide variety of MP3 players from all sorts of different vendors, different sizes and shapes and feature sets and capacities. They were as ubiquitous for a long time as portable CD players were. And portable CD players were ubiquitous for, probably 20 years themselves. So it really kind of got me thinking just about this, nature of the shift in formats yet again that we seem to be kind of right in the middle of and potentially what it all means. So I want to back up a little bit and kind of maybe briefly cover the history of these portable players, or at least my interaction with them, my experience with it. Because unlike CD players, MP3 players are something that I've been with kind of since the beginning, right? I'm old enough to remember formats prior to compact disc, and I'm old enough to have owned formats prior to compact disc. I think it's kind of crazy that I'm getting out my vinyl collection from when I was a little kid again and playing it now, if you know what I mean. But I'm also young enough where compact disc was kind of the mainstay format when I started to really buy music myself. I started picking up music in earnest with money that I was earning myself probably in the mid-90s. And it was always on CD, simply because that was a very convenient format. It was probably the most popular format, and I liked the sound quality. I liked the convenience. I liked everything about CD. But what really got me much more interested in music, and especially music technology, the equipment and process of, playing back music and all that, was the dawn of the MP3 era. I remember the very first MP3 I ever had. I don't I can't really remember which song it was, but I remember listening to an MP3 for the first time in probably 1999, and I was blown away with how relatively good it sounded. I mean, yeah, the file itself was like 128 kilobit. It was about 3 megabytes in size, which is like nothing today, right? We're used to much bigger file sizes, much higher bit rates. But even then, compared to other computer audio, in quotes, from that era, and I'm talking about things like Real Player, which sounded horrible, MP3s were amazing, and the portability of the files and what you could do with them was really what kind of sparked my imagination. And so I think it caught up a lot of other people too. You know, Napster really took off in that late 90s kind of era and into the beginning of the 2000s. And MP3s, at first, I feel, were really just kind of a container format. They were really just a way to get music from, one place to another, but not necessarily its ultimate destination. Case in point, I remember back in high school in the late 90s getting MP3 files and burning them to CDs to like play in the car or on my, portable CD player. Or even better, burning them to CDs so that I could then copy them over to minidisc, something like that. So, they weren't ubiquitous as a format that devices could play. But in terms of way of getting music back and forth, they were amazing. It feels like in the early 2000s is when that all flipped and that connection finally was really made, where you could not only use MP3s as that kind of portability factor for music, but also as the ultimate way to play that music. Of course, MP3 players existed prior to the early 2000s. They had been around for several years before that, but they were not that great of an experience, or they were very expensive, or both. Generally, flash media sizes were small at the time. You could only fit a few songs onto a media card that would go into one of those players. And to buy more media cards were very expensive. Flash media just wasn't as cheap as it is today. There were some hard drive based ones, but those were also big and bulky. They were about the size of a portable CD player, but heavier. Battery life wasn't that great. Yes, you were able to put more songs on there, but the user interface often was a little bit clunky. Apple really made waves. Of course, they weren't the first company to do MP3 players, like I said, but Apple really made waves with the iPod, the original iPod, because it fixed a lot of the problems that other portable MP3 players had at the time. It dealt with the capacity problem by using a small hard drive, but it also dealt with the physical size problem by using an even smaller hard drive than what those other players used. And most notably, it really fixed the user interface issue by coming up with a really clean and intuitive way to do it. I think one of the smartest things Apple has ever done was when it finally wrote iTunes and provided support for iPods to be used on Windows computers. You all know me as a Mac user, but I am a multi-platform person, and believe it or not, in the early 2000s, especially when I went off to college, I actually had a PC. I wasn't using a Mac as a daily driver. So the ability to finally be able to buy an iPod and hook it up to my PC and sync all of my music over to it was very, very appealing. This was not my very first iPod, though, actually. I only picked this one up a few years ago, really just for fun to look at, memories. I had a friend who had one of these, and I'd beg it off him all the time to play Brick Breaker, that sort of thing. But my very first MP3 player was actually this guy. This is a Sony portable CD player, but what's notable about it is you could burn MP3 files directly to a CD and it would play them. And I don't mean burn them as audio, I mean you could just write the files directly to the disc in data format. It had folder up and down buttons so you could navigate through. It was only a 2-line display. It wasn't an incredible experience, But what really appealed to me with this unit back in 2001, I think, when I got it, was the simple fact that the media for it was incredibly cheap. CDRs were, what, 50 cents a piece at the time? You could just write all of your MP3 files to a CDR and fill it up and have at least several albums worth of music with you. This thing took regular AA batteries as well, which was also incredibly convenient. And if you didn't have an MP3 disc to listen to, it'd play regular CDs as well. And that was all great for a while. But as my collection began to grow and I continued to buy CDs through, the early 2000s even, I still buy CDs now, I should say, the convenience of just leaving everything native MP3 format really started to catch up to me. And so I got my first iPod, which was one of the third generation iPods. It was the first that had the all-touch interface on it. Unfortunately, I don't have it anymore. I've rather foolishly sold it a few years after I bought it to upgrade to a newer one. That was one of the ones that had the color screen and could play video, that sort of thing. I actually stepped through a number of different iPods, generally because I wanted more capacity. Which I suppose is kind of an interesting and maybe fun kind of side note. I think in some ways having all of this music available to us, like I really wanted to try to do back then, where I kept buying bigger and bigger iPods with the goal of being able to have my entire music collection on me all the time. For me at least, having that is more of a hindrance than it is a help, because I get kind of paralyzed by choice, if you know what I mean, where, and I deal with this in the car all the time, especially where, it's like I want to put some music on, but I don't know what I want to listen to. I start scrolling through the list. If there are more items for me to scroll through the list, the more and more there is, the harder it is for me to make a decision. A smaller, more concise, shorter list is actually a better thing for me, I've found, because at least I've got fewer things to pick through, and if none of them are really appealing to me at the time, I just pick the closest thing and move on, right? Instead of agonizing for, minutes about, well, I don't want to listen to this, I don't want to listen to that. It's like, well, I've got maybe 3 dozen choices here. I'm just going to pick one and move on. So, interesting little side note there, but why I kept stepping through iPods was, that reason. I felt like I wanted to have my entire music collection with me so I could, if I ever had just, this sudden urge to listen to a song, I could listen to it. Of course, now we completely get around all of that with streaming music, right? A lot of the streaming music services that you subscribe to, it's an all-you-can-eat kind of a model, and you can just listen to whatever you want. If a certain song pops into your head and you just have to listen to it, within 30 seconds, probably even less, you found it and it started playing. And it's all in the convenience of just having it on your smartphone or having it on your computer just right there. But that didn't exist back in the early to, at this point, mid-2000s. You still had to have everything local. And DRM was actually a big issue as well. When you'd go and buy music files, a lot of times they had copy protection so that you could only synchronize them to certain devices or so many times, and you couldn't share them with other people. Thankfully, we've gotten past that as well, at least with the music you can buy, although also kind of getting into streaming, we're really also getting away from a music ownership kind of model, right? It's really going more and more towards we're renting music, we're leasing music, than at least we're buying a copy that we can keep perpetually. With those subscription services, if you stop paying, all that music goes away. Whereas, it may suck to spend $10 or $12 on an album, but when you do that, it doesn't get taken away from you, which is nice. And I think that's been kind of a lot of the appeal to MP3 players for a long time. They, in some ways, really just took over where portable CD players left off. I know portable CD players still exist. You can still kind of buy them. All the big name manufacturers, last I checked, have gotten out of that market. I think even Sony, believe it or not, has stopped making portable CD players. which is crazy for me to think of. But, you know, again, technology moves on, and while CDs are still being sold, they're not nearly as commonplace as digital music in terms of files, and still not as commonplace as streaming. And what CDs are available to buy are becoming less and less. In fact, I find this really interesting. If you follow me on Instagram, I posted up an image of a vinyl album that I picked up not too long ago. It's actually not a new album, it's an older one, but it's called Big Knock by Jaded Incorporated. It's by a couple of people. One of them is Mayer Hawthorne, if you're familiar with his music, but it's definitely a more kind of techno, almost like urban, futuristic, but draconian kind of dark future type of sound. It's really, really cool. I dig that album a lot, and I'm really glad I was able to finally buy it on vinyl, because that's the only physical format, as far as I can tell, that album ever came out in. It never came out on CD. I've never been able to find any references to it ever having been sold on CD. All you could get it through was digital distribution, like buying a copy off of iTunes or buying it off of Amazon or streaming it, or this limited vinyl release. And I definitely think that's the way things are going. And when all of the music stores, online music stores, MP3 files, the iTunes, that sort of thing, when those really started to hit their stride, I think marked the beginning of the end for compact disc as a daily use type of format. And it almost shifted, you know, to that kind of portability container format. I can tell you every CD that I've bought for the last probably 15 years, it's only been played once. And that's to put it in my computer to rip it to MP3, or now I rip them all to a lossless format. And then the CD gets put in storage and never really gets touched again. And I kind of have a feeling that MP3s are perhaps going to be going through that same thing again, where, you know, maybe MP3s are just going to become that backup or that container kind of format where we're going to bring them in to our computers and use them in some ways, but on a daily basis, we're going to keep listening to music in another way. So to bring this whole discussion kind of full circle, what's the story with portable MP3 players? Well, sales on them definitely aren't done. There are still manufacturers that make them, even though Apple is really kind of getting out of the market. And yes, I know the iPod Touch is technically an iPod. It's got that in the name, but I think most people would agree that the iPod Touch is much closer to being an iPhone than it is to being an iPod. It's a multi-function, multi-purpose kind of device. You can put apps on it. You can put games on it. You can surf the web on it. You can play music and videos on it. It's an iPhone that can't place phone calls and there's no cellular data, and that's about it. Whereas the iPod has always been something much simpler. Yes, later models were able to play video files, but that's really about all the farther they were ever able to go. None of the proper iPod models, other than the Touch, ever got into streaming music. They never really had Wi-Fi, anything like that. It was all just you sync it to your computer through a cable, copy music down to it, unplug the cable, and off you go, and it's self-contained. I like that simplicity. It's why I take a Shuffle with me when I go running, because, you know, it's really easy. The fact that the Shuffle doesn't have a screen on it is actually appealing to me. You would think that it'd be a detriment, but you know what? I use it exactly as its name implies. I copy a bunch of files to it, leave it in shuffle mode, and then just hit play when I want to start and pause when I'm done. I don't really want to have to deal with the screen because, again, with the choices thing, you know, maybe next thing you know, I'm futzing with the screen trying to play a song instead of focusing on something else. That's my appeal for the Shuffle. In addition, of course, to the cost and all of that. And the Nano has had the same appeal to a lot of people too, where they just want a simple music player. And they don't necessarily need bells and whistles and that sort of thing. Or, you know, maybe someone is too young to have a smartphone. You know, maybe an MP3 player has been a great choice for a child, or a great choice for an older person, where a smartphone might be too confusing for someone, you know, who's older to use. Maybe they've got limited eyesight, limited cognition, limited, you know, control of their hands. You know, physical buttons can be a lot easier for people like that. So I think that's a large reason why MP3 players have stuck around as long as they have. And in some ways, I'm actually surprised that they've stuck around as long as they have, because we've had streaming music for quite a while now, and smartphones have definitely been an everyday carry for a very large proportion of the population for a number of years now. It's not like it's a new thing where within the last 1 or 2 years, suddenly everybody's got a smartphone. You know, smartphones, almost 10 years, I would say they've been an everyday carry. Of course, they've been around longer than that. I was a BlackBerry addict long before I started getting into iPhone. But, you know, they've become so multifunctional that you can't really help but just push everything to the smartphone now. Case in point, when I got my first iPhone, I stopped buying new iPods. I even saw the writing on the wall at that point. I haven't bought a new iPod other than replacement iPod shuffles for the ones that I periodically kill. I haven't bought a new iPod in years. I can't even remember the last one that I bought. Maybe it was an iPod Nano, but it wasn't even this latest generation that got discontinued. It was several generations prior to that. So, you know, it's obviously a streaming future, whether we like it or not. I understand it. I get it. I'm not terribly thrilled with the concept of music is now just this rental service, and if you stop paying, it disappears. Just like I'm also not that thrilled with services like Netflix and Hulu and all of that, where it's just a rental service and, you know, you pay for it, and when you stop paying for it, you don't have it anymore. And also, all that content can get taken away from you with contract disputes and all of that. You know, it's like a monthly occurrence now of seeing articles online about here's all the new content that's showing up to Netflix this month, and then also the content that's disappearing from it. We're seeing the same things with streaming music, whereas MP3s, you know, once they're out there, once you buy a copy of it, it's really difficult for them to take that away from you again, especially when you've got a dedicated device to play it on. So in some ways, I think we've really kind of come full circle. You know, it's definitely a sign for Apple that even Apple, who grew or started to grow, I should say, to the size that they are now, that was instigated with the iPod. You know, the first iMac was a real attention getter, and it sold really well, and it brought Apple back from the brink. But the iPod was what really started making that company some money. And it really kickstarted a whole kind of economy on its own. And lots of companies benefited from it, not just Apple. Sony even started coming out with its own line of dedicated MP3 players. And Sony still makes dedicated MP3 players. But other than these integrated sport band ones where they're kind of built into the headphones, and I think like a single model of inexpensive kind of iPod Nano size MP3 player, Sony's been actually going after the high-end market. And they're not even really MP3 players so much as they are audio players. And you can load lossless audio and high-res audio onto them and get a really, really good listening experience. You know, audio and Sony have gone together for a very long time. And I think even seeing a company like Sony start to pull back from that format, well, you know, it just drives the point home that we're moving on to something else. And who knows how long this whole streaming era will last? Who knows what's going to come after it? Will we move back into physical media? Will these become the next vinyl LP resurgence? Will portable CD players become the next vinyl LP resurgence? I think CDs very well might make a comeback at some point. I don't think vinyl is going to be going away anytime soon, but I do think a lot of the older technology kind of works in cycles, and especially with the desire for tangible physical things, MP3 players, well, they may get their due yet again. So, I am, of course, as always, curious as to your thoughts. Do you still even own an MP3 player? Have you ever owned a portable MP3 player? What's been your favorite one? What's been your least favorite one? How many have you been through? Just share your thoughts down in the comments section below, and as always, please be nice. If you like the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.